In one church I served, on the Sunday closest to All Saints' Day, they had a tradition of printing the names in the bulletin of everyone in that church who had passed on since the last All Saints' Day. And the names were read in the worship service, and a bell chimed after each name was read. And in that church, there was about 800 members and about 400 people in worship, so sometimes the list was pretty long. And I remember one time after that All Saints Sunday worship service, a person from the congregation came up to me and said, I don't really like this tradition. It's kind of a downer. She said, I think of fall as a season of abundance. It's harvest, it's celebration, it's football games, and it's Thanksgiving and apple orchards. I don't like the idea of paying so much attention to death and dying. And this was in a part of the country where all the leaves were off the trees and the grasses were all withered and gone. There was imagery of death and dying all around us, but in her mind, fall was not about that. And I think of a dialogue I had with another person in the church who was relaying a conversation he had had with his wife. And he had been talking with her about he'd been feeling sort of heavy lately, low energy. And he was wondering aloud if maybe he needed to have another cup of coffee each morning, or maybe an energy drink, or something else. And she said, well, you may need something else, but maybe you just need to grieve the fact that our son got married, the baby of the family, a few weeks ago, and now we are empty nesters, and you miss them. And he said to me, he was telling the story because he said to me, do you think that's true? I mean, isn't the point of parenting to get them to launch? Weddings are celebrations. Shouldn't I just be happy? I said, well, sure, it's not either or. So maybe there is some need to grieve, to feel some sadness. Maybe take that to God. And I could tell as I said this, though, he was incredibly uncomfortable with this idea. And in ways that's not surprising because I've grown up in probably similar cultures that many of us grew up in, and there's not a lot of emphasis on grief. I was facilitating a grief group in my last church, and how many times I heard people relay stories, people in the grief group, where someone had said to them, it was just time to move on, to get over it and move on, as if there was a certain amount of time that you were allowed to be sad or whatever, and now get on with it. And the people were sharing these stories because they didn't feel that way. Or even collectively, there can be collective trauma that could require grief of, like, say, 9/11 or school shootings. But then often leaders in communities will say things like, well, it's time to bring closure to this and just move on. Get on with life, get on with things, without honoring the trauma, the grief, the loss. So it's part of the atmosphere a lot of us have grown up in or seen or experienced. And yet, in this spiritual path of Jesus, there's this call to authenticity. There's a call to pay attention to what's real. There's a call to invite God into all the things. And so if we're skipping the feelings, for example, if we're have an aversion to grief, we might be keeping ourselves from possibilities and gifts that are available to us. Jesus says we have to lose life to find it, that there's this acknowledgement that in the paying attention to the losses and the letting go, there can often be room for the receiving and the something more or something else. And loss is hard. Death is hard. Death is hard. It takes from us a person. It's so disorienting. We're wired. I have this book called, it's about the neurology of grief, called The Grieving Brain. But just even from the scientific perspective, all of our neurons are wired around a person, and now the person's not there. What do we do with that? Where do we go with that? Our hearts are broken. And then there's the other losses. We might think of them as little deaths that sometimes we think aren't a big deal. The doctor we really trusted retired. The friend moved away to get a better job. Our favorite columnist in the newspaper no longer there, downsized for budget cuts. But these are losses. These are losses. And Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn. That's grieving. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And that word means with strength. There's a sense of something strengthening, something powerful in the grieving. Not something weak, not something to be avoided, but something powerful in the grieving. That grief could be seen as spiritual practice. Grief can be good. And Jesus didn't just teach it, he lived it. And we see it in the gospel story before us this morning. So in that story, what precedes it, it's a long story in the Gospel of John, so you didn't hear all of it. But what precedes it is that Jesus receives word from Mary and Martha. So these are family friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, our brothers, sisters. And he receives word from the women that Lazarus, whom you love, so dear friend, is ill. And that probably expectation is, so come do something. Come be with us. And in the story that precedes this, Jesus takes his sweet time. And Jesus says this sort of odd thing when we look at the whole story. He says, this illness, he's talking to his disciples, this illness will not lead to death. But actually in the story, literally, it leads to death. And so there's a reminder that if we only read the stories literally, we might miss some things. So if we think about the metaphor of death in the stories, death is the ultimate expression of separation, of alienation. And so perhaps Jesus is pointing to, we will not ultimately be separated. There will not ultimately be alienation, but that there's something more that's to come. So Jesus, though, makes his way to the village where they are, and we find out that when he gets there, Lazarus is 4 days gone. And that might seem like a weird detail. Like, why are we mentioning the 4 days? In the ancient world, they'll remember, we don't have official coroners. We don't have the monitors, brainwave activity, etc. So occasionally, sometimes people were in, today we might say a coma, and it was seen as death. Or there are times, it's rare, but times people got buried alive. They weren't really dead. But if someone has been in a tomb 4 days, they are really gone. So that's why the story is likely giving us that detail. So as Jesus arrives, people are, it says, weeping. And remember, weeping is not just like gentle shedding of tear. The word weep means bawling. As a friend calls it, ugly crying, right? The contorted face, the little, it's not like just the gentle, controlled thing. Weeping is a full-on expression of the emotion. And also, as Jesus arrives, Mary and Martha, they're grieving too, and some of their grief is anger. If you had been here, you can hear the tone. If you had just been here. So Jesus, I think of it in this story, Jesus is met with a storm of grief all around him, tears and anger. Maybe you've stepped into those spaces and places. And then we hear in the story, Jesus himself is deeply moved. And then a little later in the story, it says, if you had the King James Version, you know it is the shortest verse in the Bible, because sometimes kids had to memorize a Bible verse, and they chose this one. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And we might step back from the story if we're not as familiar with it, or just to take a moment, if we have been familiar with it, is ask, well, why? Because Jesus, remember, he was so chill about this whole thing. And there's going to be good things, or something of God's glory will be shown. So why is Jesus, what's he got to cry about? Doesn't he know it's all going to be all right? Well, on one level, I think about the times where, don't we at times in the face of certain kind of losses or hard things, intellectually we know, well, we've gotten through that before. Or intellectually we know, like the doctor retired, just for example, I will get another doctor and I'll probably be okay. But we still have a loss. It's still real. Even if intellectually we might understand there could be something later down the road, in the moment we're experiencing the loss. So there's that part of the story. But I also think about Jesus is entering into the storm of grief and loss. The storm gets in him. I mean, that's part of the chaos of death, the fear, the turmoil. It gets in us, and we're churning, right? In the place of loss. We're churning. Jesus is not Teflon. Jesus is not a waxed car with it just beating up on his outsides. The storm gets in him. all of that churning, he lets in. And then, and this seems important, he then also practices letting it out. So he's not impervious to the storm, but sometimes, if we're in grief and loss, we might want to pretend that we've got our shields up, but likely the chaos gets in us, the storm gets in us. But some of us, we were taught, shove that down. Big girls, big boys, don't cry. Shove it down, push it aside, pretend it's not there, just get busy. Just get busy. Just get busy. There was an article I saw, I think it was from The Atlantic, and it said, things to watch to distract yourself during election week. And I read it because I want some distraction maybe, but also there's this idea of just numb yourself. Stay busy, stay distracted because you're anxious. So that's part of what we can do with that storm. But Jesus practices letting it out. Jesus wept. So when I think of the image of storms, right? Rain and wind and water, well, tears. It's a letting go, the storm flowing out. And then Jesus doesn't let the storm flow out in his own weeping. And remember, Jesus isn't just shedding a tear. He's ugly crying. So he's bawling. Jesus is bawling. He lets it out, but he doesn't then just stay empty. I think sometimes what can happen, and maybe sometimes this is what we're afraid of with grief, is we might shed the tears and they'll never, ever end. And sometimes we do, though. We might empty ourselves out, and then, though, we just sort of suck some more storm back in and then empty out. And we're like with those recycling fountains in someone's garden. But Jesus doesn't stay empty. There's the emptying out, but then we hear in the story, Jesus prays. Jesus prays. So there's the letting go of the storm, but there's inviting in of the Spirit. And I think of all those biblical images and stories of the Spirit of God and the chaos, the storms, of the Spirit moving over the waters of the deep in Genesis 1, of the Spirit driving the Red Sea apart and the Israelites crossed from slavery to freedom, of Peter walking on the water in the storm. So this picture, the storm's real, experience the storm, feel the storm, but invite the Spirit into the storm. And what happens as the Spirit is in the storm, in the chaos, there's new life. There's creativity. There's possibility. And then that's what happens in the story. Jesus has wept, a releasing of the storm. Jesus is inviting the Spirit of creativity into the storm. And then Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus comes forth from the grave. And here, it's a little bit of a sidebar. It's important to remember I was talking about metaphor and symbol, coming back to that in the story. Jesus is not in the business of bringing dead people back to life, because there's just a couple of stories in the Gospels where that happens. So most people in these stories, they die and they stay dead. And also, if you think about Lazarus, he's brought back to life, but he's going to die again. So the point isn't avoiding physical death. The point is the possibilities and the power of life even in the face of death. And I think about in the story specifically, there's this detail about he's wrapped in the grave clothes, but we don't have to talk about that. Again, more metaphor. Jesus says, unbind him, set him free. And so there's the invitation with the grief and the prayer that there's not just any old life, it's not just survival life, it's unbound life. It's greater freedom, greater possibility. This is the life that comes with good grief as spiritual practice that Jesus is living into and showing those around him. And I think about every time I'm working on a sermon, it helps me. So thank you for calling me to this work. Because when I'm wrestling with the scriptural texts and reading the commentaries and the articles and in my own prayer around it, it's not like I've arrived on some mountaintop and I will disperse the wisdom to you all down below. It's I'm on this journey too. I'm wrestling with it because I want to live it too. And I'm mentioning that because, it happens all the time. But this week it hit me particularly about the goodness of grief because I wasn't doing it. So on one level, there is a lot of this year for me was consumed by a cancer diagnosis and testing and surgery and recovery. And there's trauma in my body and in my mind and heart about that. And there's been losses around that. And I'm all right, but there's still loss. And I realized I need to spend some time grieving some of that. And then I was also thinking about a loss for me as we move into yet another election, and just the incredible chaos and distress around this process that just seems to be the normal for us now as a nation. And I was thinking about my grandparents whose images are on this memory table and what they taught me about what it would mean to be a good citizen and what the promise of the American dream was and what we were called to live into. And I was thinking about them. I was thinking about my grandfather who got a Purple Heart landing at Normandy because he believed that dictators needed to be stopped because they destroyed the vulnerable. I think about a grandmother who told me the story about the time they had a little corner store outside of a factory, mostly serving factory workers. And I've shared the fullness of the story. I'll just do the brief version right now. Previously, I've shared the fullness of the story. But there was this burly factory worker one day, and she was giving away some penny candy to some black children. And the burly factory worker called those children the N-word. And my 5'2" daughter of immigrants grandmother walked around the counter, got up in his face and said, "You get out of my store and you do not come back." Or I think about another grandmother who, when a college friend came out to me as gay and was part of a faith tradition where he was told to pray the gay away and it was not working and he was afraid he was going to go to hell. And I knew in my UCC church we didn't talk that way. But I also hadn't been taught very much, honestly, so I didn't know what to say to him. But my grandmother, she had that Bible, and she had her prayer journal, and she'd been in churches and the women's circles and the studies, and so I went to her, and she said, "You tell him that God loves him just as he is." And this is decades before there's any open and affirming churches. So I think about the witness, my great cloud of witnesses, about what they taught me about what it meant to be a good citizen, a person in the world. And I see the constant lies. I see the blatant racism. I experience the misogyny and the homophobia and the transphobia, and I see it amping up. And of course, there's always politicians who do this stuff. But there's cheering crowds in the face of hateful language and lies. And I feel betrayed. This is not what I was promised. And then I realize I need to grieve. There's losses I'm experiencing. There may be work to do. I'm sure there is. No matter how things turn out, there's always work to do. But I need to first grieve. I need to weep. I need to express the anger. And I've been doing that this week. Now I have some answer for you all. But I start to see a little more threads of light and a little more hope. And so I remind us as we move into this, I'll call it election week, because you know Tuesday we will not really know what's going on. And no matter who wins, some of you are going to experience loss because your candidate didn't. And then there's going to be, though we know, there's going to be challenges and chaos and probably courts and judges, and the media will just amplify it because that's where the money is. And so it'll be good in the places of distress to not keep doom scrolling, to not just have the 24-hour news blaring, to take moments and times to stop and grieve. Grieve the fear, grieve the distress, grieve whatever loss you're experiencing. And it's going to be different for different people. But make room for the grief like Jesus does. And don't just then be empty, but pray it. Ask for God to enter in. Ask for trusted people who are reminders of God to you to enter in. And then there will be life that rises. Not just any old life, but unbound life. Free life. And God knows we all need it. Praise God. Amen.